Hello and welcome to this special discussion where we will talk about the Indian and Russian responses to the COVID-19 pandemic and also try to understand its social, political, and economic consequences. This is part of an ongoing online collaboration between the Observer Research Foundation India and the Wildlife Discussion Club Russia. For this discussion today, I am pleased to welcome Uman Kurian, Senior Fellow and Head of the Health Initiative at ORF, and Igor Makarov, Head, School of World Economy, National Research University, High School of Economics, Moscow. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. The first question is for you, Uman. If you could describe in short, what has been India's strategy towards dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic? And given how closely you've been following it, what are your thoughts on its effectiveness that can be gauged at the moment?
Thank you, Nivedita. I look forward to learning from Dr. Makarov about Russia's unique approach that has kept deaths to a minimum despite having a very high number of reported cases. We are still in the early stages of this pandemic. However, the world is struggling to understand why its spread and devastation till now has been less than anticipated in many large countries of the world. First of all, India is not an outlier. Out of the 10 most populated countries of the world, covering 60% of world population, only two, USA and Russia, have a total number of confirmed cases per million population that is greater than the world average. When it comes to deaths per million population, 9 out of 10 most populous countries have an average lesser than the global average. So India is not an outlier. In terms of deaths, even Russia is not an outlier. India has, as of now, among the lowest population-adjusted infection rates and death rates. India has been one of the earliest countries to get into a national economic lockdown. Within the federal system, the states, even those ruled by parties other than the one at the center, have largely supported the strict containment measures that the center suggested and implemented them. Unlike Russia or many other countries, India's strategy hasn't been based on aggressive testing, but we focused on a more narrow, focused strategic testing and a graded expansion. Till now, it seems to have worked. It remains to be seen how the strategy is adapted to the new reality as economic lockdown is slowly being shifted. Also, there is a broad acceptance within the political class that the extended lockdown is an unrealistic solution. That is where we are right
now. The same question for you, Igor. What are your thoughts on the strategy and effectiveness of the response of Russian state to the COVID-19 pandemic?
The coronavirus outbreak in Russia, it also started a little bit later than in the European countries and then in the US. And before the mid-March, there was a hope in Russia that probably the country would be unaffected or relatively unaffected by the pandemic. But starting from the middle of March, the situation started to deteriorate very quickly, and the number of cases rose from several hundreds to more than 100,000 to the moment. The borders were closed in the mid-March for foreigners, and the so-called high alert status was introduced nationwide also in the middle of March. In late March, the president declared the nationwide work holiday week first, then it was extended to the whole month. Now it was extended again until the 12th of May. So these measures, they are very painful for the national economy, of course, but at the same time, they allowed to decelerate the speed of the epidemic. They allowed flattening the curve and decreasing the load on the healthcare system. So in principle, from the epidemiologic point of view, Russia is more or less successful compared to the other European countries, but it still has not achieved the peak of the outbreak, and so it's probably too early to compare the efficiency of responses. Just when we reach the peak, then it will be possible. Now probably not. To the moment, I may say that it is relatively successful compared to some other European countries, but still, again, it is too early to judge and to make more exact estimates.
Okay, so till now our focus has been on individual state responses to the pandemic. Here I would like to get, Uman, your opinion on the role of multilateral organizations in dealing with the pandemic of this scale. So how do you think their role is going to play out, and what is going to be the future impact of this pandemic on the functioning of some of these leading multilateral organizations?
The multilateral organizations, they do have an important role, particularly when it comes to health systems with severe resource constraints, whose preparedness to deal with a stealthy virus such as this may be very limited. There have been instances of WHO, for example, dragging its feet initially and failing to move proactively. But overall, the technical inputs and resources that WHO brings to the table are important, particularly to countries that have a limited capacity to respond to a pandemic like this. The World Bank also moved very quickly and approved a fast-track $1 billion India COVID-19 emergency response and health systems preparedness project to help India prevent, detect, and respond to the pandemic and strengthen its public health preparedness, which was the largest ever health sector support from the bank to India. The UN agencies have a tendency of operating within a facts by consensus framework often, which impacts their effectiveness, but all these multilateral agencies have important roles to play. As the world is interconnected and some countries failing to address COVID will have ramifications across the world. In India, UNICEF and WHO are key partners of India's Ministry of Health and Family Welfare in its response to COVID. But yes, I mean, I'm very clear that the UN agencies in particular will have to be more democratized as we move forward.
Okay, so Uman, you have focused on WHO, the UN agencies, the World Bank. So Igor, if I take forward the idea of multilateralism and collective response, from you, I would like to understand about the role of BRICS and how do you think this pandemic will affect the future agenda formation in BRICS? And a related question is, we have another crisis looming over the world, that of climate change. So how do you think response to this pandemic is going to have an impact on future policy making when it comes to climate change?
Yeah, I think that you were very correct to draw the parallel between the climate change and the pandemic. And I think that one of the parallels is unfortunately that in both cases, multilateral cooperation, it really fails. And the major role in solving the global problem, it really belongs to passes to the national governments. In both, in the case of pandemic and in case of climate change. In terms of climate change, the emissions certainly will decrease as a result of the pandemic, but then they will restore to the previous levels after the economies recover. However, I think that the coronavirus, it really gives an opportunity to accelerate the green transition of the world, but actually the major chance consists not in the pandemic itself, but in the response to the pandemic, especially when all the countries will stop the lockdown and some new crisis packages will be adopted. So now all the crisis packages that were adopted in the major economies, they were directed at like saving population and some businesses. But when the economies will function normally and when people will leave their homes and will go back to their workplaces and so their unemployment will be very high, so many governments will have to launch some new crisis packages and like to create jobs in different sectors. And it would be critically important in what sectors would these jobs created, and in what sectors, to what sectors the major attention of the governments would be paid. In the last financial crisis of 2008-2009, the priority, one of the priorities was in all the major economies was the green sector, green technologies, and it gave the tremendous impulse to the development of green technologies in the European Union, in China, in the US, and so on. And I think that this time probably it would be done again, and so the green technologies would get some new impulse from the governments. But it will happen or not happen in at least in a couple of months, when the new crisis packages directed to specific sectors would be launched in the major economies. And it would be the chance. It would be the chance to use the pandemic for something good. And so I think that all the the major economies should use this chance, actually.
Igor, I think you have raised a very, very important point about the impact of this entire crisis on the economy of different countries. And because my next question to Uman is related to that. So Uman, how do you think this will have a long-term impact on the population of India, especially the economically weaker sections? And also, if I could get a sense from you, because different Indian states have had different levels of effectiveness in dealing with this crisis, what do you think could be the potential political fallout in the near future?
As of now, we don't know about the quantum of the direct health impact of the disease per se on the population. Barring a few cities and states where the spread has been quick with very high human cost. Across India, the real impact has been on the economy and also on regular healthcare delivery, which has got severely affected. And many fear high human cost due to healthcare access being curtailed for non-COVID health conditions. And of course, the impact of the economic lockdown has been very harsh. And since severe cases and deaths have been relatively low in India, luckily, it will be more and more difficult politically to continue with strict measures. So ensuring voluntary compliance to physical distancing measures and protecting the high-risk population seem to be the available way forward for the government as the economy is brought back on track slowly. So talking about the political fallout, barring a few instances, there has been general support across the political spectrum to the measures led by the central ministries. Right now, India is being divided into, India has 755 districts. So these districts are divided into green, orange, and red zones, and planning is on to bring green and orange zones slowly back to normal, one step at a time. It may be a slow and sometimes acrimonious process in the often combative political scene, but I see general consensus on the need for being cautious among political parties as of now about going back to normal. So they don't really want the rapid back to normal route. They want it to be a step-by-step, evidence-informed process, generally.
Igor, you've heard from Uman how the various Indian states are reacting and to this crisis. If I could bring you in on a similar question, how well equipped is Russia, in your opinion, to deal with the economic impact of this crisis? And also, if you could give us a sense of how it could affect the political dynamics in the country in the near future.
Yes, the Russian economy will suffer dramatically from coronavirus, it is for sure. As many other countries, Russia will face simultaneously the supply shock, so because the enterprises are closed and do not produce anything, and the supply chains were destroyed, and so on. And at the same time, demand shock, because people stay at home and they do not consume many goods and services they consumed before. But at the same time, Russia also additionally faces a severe oil price shock, because for Russia, oil is a absolutely critical good, and hydrocarbons amount to 70% of the exports of the country and 40% of budget incomes. So the drop of oil prices would have a very significant impact on the Russian economy. The month of work holiday would cost the economy about probably 1.5 up to 2% of GDP. But the overall losses would be much more because of all these factors, and probably 5–6% of GDP. It's not easy to predict right now, but it would be the very significant impact. And I'm not sure, unfortunately, that the economy would recover very quickly because many businesses won't survive, and so the living standards would fall significantly. Oil prices would probably not return to the previous levels very quickly again. So the Russian economy is very much affected by the crisis. We have some buffer, of course. We have a very large sovereign wealth fund. We have huge currency reserves. We have very low level of governmental debt, especially external debt compared to other countries. So Russian economy is more or less protected from the crisis, but more active governmental policy probably could have been implemented to support population, first of all, and not to let businesses survive in order to give them a chance to recover more or less quickly after the crisis.
Okay. Now that we have discussed as to how the situation exists today, I would like both of you to do a little bit of forward thinking. So Uman, if I could ask you, what do you think are going to be the key challenges for India as it goes forward in dealing with the pandemic?
Main challenge as of now will be the main and the immediate challenge as of now will be to keep deaths at a lower level as the virus spreads. The virus will spread. This means protecting the high-risk populations as economic activity is restored bit by bit across the country. It will entail making sure that green zones are indeed green by deploying broader testing strategies and ensuring voluntary compliance of physical distancing measures. The current levels of testing in India are inadequate. So managing low-income urban settlements with a high population density will be a particularly difficult challenge. I'm sure the government, even the local governments, have been thinking hard on it, and they have devised solutions. And coming to the economy, it is a fact that the Indian economy has taken a major hit, just like Russia. With 90% workers in the informal sector, social protection systems will have to be ramped up considerably. And perhaps for India, this is a good time to make the National Health Insurance Scheme universal. It is already available for free for more than half of the Indian population. And it can be expanded to the non-poor on a premium payment basis. Perhaps it can be made free for a year or two when the whole population is struggling with the virus. So that is how I see the immediate and the medium term.
Igor, I'll ask the same question to you. What will be the key challenges for Russia in the days and months ahead as it deals with this crisis?
Yeah, actually, the major challenges are those that I have already mentioned. So the major question is whether all the businesses in Russia, or at least most of the businesses, would be able to survive and to help recovering the economy after the crisis. So, because what is the difference of this crisis from the financial crisis? For example, 2009 in 2008, 2009. The difference is that all the assets are still existent, and they were not vanished. They did not vanish. They were not devalued. They are still existent, and all the businesses will start working when people come back to the normal lives. But the problem is that before the lockdown finishes, many of these businesses may go bankrupt. people lost their incomes, people lost their jobs, the private debt would rise, and it may provoke the financial crisis and so on. So the major objective of the government now, and it is not only in Russia but in many other countries as well, is to support people and the affected businesses, just to let them survive during the lockdown and to make them an opportunity to return to the normal life after the lockdown finishes. And unfortunately, the Russian government is widely criticized because of the very modest policy regarding the in the era of coronavirus. Because the stimulus package in Russia is much more modest than in many other countries. It is just about 1.5% of GDP, while in many countries, many developed countries, it is from 5 to 15% of GDP. So in Russia, it is much more modest, and that may be the problem, because if businesses go bankrupt and if they then the crisis would shift to the banking system, it would be much more serious than just the effect of pandemic. It would be the full-scale economic crisis, which would be deteriorated further by the falling oil prices and so on. So this would be the major challenge, of course. And so probably, and all we hope that the government would be more active in responding to this challenge already now, just to give the businesses opportunity to survive and to wait for, give them time to survive during the lockdown.
Okay, so as we draw towards the end of this discussion, I would like to get final comments from both of you. So, Uman, if you could tell us about what are the key lessons that India can learn from the world, and what are some of the things that it can export to the world in terms of its response to the pandemic?
I think we could possibly look at how similarly placed countries are building back the economy and making health systems more resilient and learn from them. Perhaps we could look at global experiences of dealing with unemployment, which is on an all-time high in India. More immediately, we could learn how similarly resource-constrained countries are deploying testing strategies to secure areas that are seeing a graded return from lockdown. Strategic and aggressive testing and isolation of patients in certain urban contexts will be useful in India to limit surges, and we could certainly learn from similarly placed countries. When it comes to lessons from India, let me say there is no national level India model. Maybe other than large platforms like Aadhaar, which have been leveraged to reach the needy with required monetary support. As a large federal democracy, the Indian approach will always be a collection of different state-level approaches. And as India is a very diverse country, these experiences can be useful to countries at different levels of socio-economic progress.
Igor, final comments from you as well. What do you think are the main lessons that the global community can draw from its response to the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think that the major lesson for Russia and for BRICS countries, for the whole world as well, is that there are always a kind of trade-off between economic growth and provision of public goods. And from the narrow growth perspective, of course, we should not invest too much in the public healthcare probably, and should not pay too much attention to international institutions, should not pay too much attention to the environment and so on. But this pandemic shown that if we ignore all these objectives, in the long term, we lose more. And by the way, we lose more in terms of economic growth as well. And what we see now is absolutely surprising for me consensus of all the major countries in the willingness to stop the economies, completely stop the economies in order to defend public health. And I think that the major lesson probably is that if public health and human lives are the top priority in bad time, so that they should also remain the top priority in good times as well. And I hope that this shift in mind that we really see nowadays in nearly all the world would probably help achieving more balanced economic development and more sustainable economic growth.
With that thought, we come to a close of our discussion today. We thank both Uman Kurian and Igor Makarov for taking time out and joining us. And thank you so much, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for interesting discussion.